Okay, here's the list of representative heroes for today. We'll begin with a little about the adventures of George II of England and Bonnie Prince Charlie, but then we'll spend quite a bit of time in Italy, especially in Venice, to see what the city looked like to Canaletto 250 years ago, and hear some of the music of Vivaldi, the greatest Italian composer of the age. Then we'll visit Vienna, where Vivaldi actually died, and see what it looked like in the 18th century, thanks to the work of Caneletto's nephew, Bernardo Bellato. And in Vienna, we'll hear about Franz Joseph Haydn, the first of the great Viennese composers, hear about Maria Theresa, for whom he wrote a symphony, and we'll see Schönbrunn Palace. We'll wind up back in England in the second half of the class to hear about the redoubtable Samuel Johnson. And we'll also see some of the work by the man who has the best claim to be called the first great native-born English painter, William Hogarth. So here's George II on horseback, looking very military, at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743, more or less leading the troops against the French, who were allied with his nephew Frederick the Great in the War of the Austrian Succession, in which, as we've heard, the English supported Frederick's enemy, Maria Theresa. George's appearance at Dettingen was to be the last by a King of England on an active battlefield, but his part consisted, according to reports, primarily of standing on a hilltop pointing his sword in the direction of the fight. This was an English victory, which Handel commemorated in the Dettingen Te Deum, but it was not a really significant victory and was followed 2 years later by the defeat of the English under George's son, the Duke of Cumberland, at Fontenoy, about which we've also heard. The upshot of all this, again, was that Maria Theresa remained in power, with Frederick agreeing to acknowledge her husband Francis as nominal Holy Roman Emperor in exchange for Silesia. Neither France nor England got any territory, but the French did agree to kick the Stuarts out of Paris, which was at least a symbolic victory for George, who regarded them as little better than terrorists. In 1744, Bonnie Prince Charlie, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, the grandson of James II, who had been kicked out of England in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, had landed with a handful of men on the coast of Scotland and assembled his followers here at Glenfinnan to begin his attempt to overthrow the House of Hanover. He was welcomed in Edinburgh, although the castle remained in English hands, and a few days later he defeated an English force at Prestonpans near the city.
O flower of Scotland, when will we see your like again?
This is a portrait of him. He then crossed the border with his ad hoc army of some 5,000 men and marched to within 100 miles or so of London before the approach of the government's much larger army under the Duke of Cumberland, combined with the lack of French support and the absence of any real enthusiasm for his cause in England, forced him to retreat back to the north. And in April 1646, Cumberland finally caught up with him here at Culloden at the north end of Loch Ness, and the resulting battle wiped out Charlie's army and all Stuart hope. Cumberland gave the rebels no quarter and killed all he could find. This is the battlefield monument. Charlie was able to escape from the battlefield and eventually, thanks to the famous Flora MacDonald and others, get to a boat that would take him back to France. Flora was imprisoned in the Tower for a year for this, but she could easily have been executed.
O flower of Scotland, when will we see your like again?
As I mentioned earlier, by the treaty that ended the War of the Austrian Succession, the Stuarts were obliged to leave Paris, and Charlie spent most of the rest of his life here in the Palazzo Balestra in Rome, mostly, it is said, in a drunken stupor, singing old Scottish ballads. His wife, the Countess of Albany, left him to live with the Italian poet Vittorio Alfieri. Charlie had no children, so the direct male Stuart line ended with him. The current Stuart claimant in the female line is Prince Albert of Bavaria, who is a descendant of James II's sister, Henrietta Anne, and Louis XIV's brother, Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans. Charlie's buried in St. Peter's. While we're in Italy, we can hear a little bit about what was going on there in the 18th century, which was not a great century for Italian art, although some famous things were products of it, like the Spanish Steps we see here. Apparently, when Charles VIII of France came through Rome on his way to try to take Naples back from Spain in 1494, he left money to have the church of Santa Trinità dei Monti, to be used by an order of French nuns in Rome, built on top of the hill here, but until the 18th century there was no proper approach to it from this side. As a result, Etienne Gouffier, a French diplomat serving in Rome in the 1660s, left money in his will for this project to be carried out, but it wasn't until 1723 that it was actually begun by the architect De Sanctis. So the French built these to an Italian church. Why are they called the Spanish Steps? Because the Piazza d'Espagna, with the Spanish embassy, is at the bottom of them. There would be some reason also to call them the English Steps, because they've been the heart of English Rome for 200 years. Babington's tea room is still just to the left, and to the right is the house in which John Keats died. In the foreground you can also see Bernini's Barcaccia, the sinking boat fountain, and as I mentioned last quarter, of the four most famous Roman fountains, the Four Rivers, the Triton, the Barcaccia here, and the Trevi, he did three, and he was also supposed to do the Trevi, the most splendid of all, but never got around to it, and it wasn't finished until 1762. Here it is now, perhaps second only to the Colosseum, among things familiar in Rome to most Americans. The builder was a fellow named Niccolo Salvi, who is, however, thought to have used at least some aspects of Bernini's original design. Salvi is said to have died as a result of contracting some disease, crawling around in the 1600-year-old tunnels and pipes bringing water to it. The same aqueduct, the so-called Aqua Vergine, famous since antiquity for providing the best tasting water in the city, and it also supplies the fountains in the Piazza Navona. The three main figures represent abundance, ocean, and air. Eventually, it became so difficult to keep the water flowing that the city resorted to just recirculating it for a week or so before pumping the basin out and refilling it. The original saying, "Drink from the Trevi and you'll be sure to return to Rome," became "Drink from the Trevi and you'll be sure to never leave." It was replumbed and restored in the 1980s, however, and is now working the way it was supposed to, I guess. In the 18th century, no tourist went to Italy without seeing Venice, which was regarded even by Italians as about as foreign a city as there was in Europe, where wine, women, and song were all imagined to be easily available in a kind of fantastic setting. This is Antonio Canaletto's picture of the Piazza San Marco about 1750, and although he is not considered a great painter and is not even mentioned by H.W. Jansen, his pictures are the most evocative and entertaining paintings of a city ever made, which were wildly popular with English visitors who took them home as souvenirs. The Duke of Bedford brought home 25 to Woburn Abbey, and Joseph Smith, the English ambassador to Venice, owned 50, which he sold to George III. This is the way the piazza looks today. Legend has it that the lines in the paving of the piazza were actually laid out as a pigeon landing field. Notice that there were no pigeons in Caneletto's picture. In the 18th century, they fed the tourists rather than the other way around today. Florian's Coffee House is still in the gallery on the right. It's one of those many places called the oldest coffee house in Europe. It's traditionally the place liberals take their espresso, although only liberals from places like Berkeley can afford $10 for an espresso. Quadris, confusingly on the left, is for conservatives. It is interesting to compare modern photos with Caneletto's pictures to see how much things have changed. Over 300 years or so, a lot has changed in some parts of the city. In the Piazza San Marco, they haven't changed that much, but this is the Campo San Vidal as it looked in the 18th century when it was occupied by a stonemason's yard, which looked across the Grand Canal to the old church of Santa Maria della Carità, next to which, on the right, the Academy Museum is to be found today. And this is what that view looks like now. In addition to its other attractions throughout the 17th and early 18th century, Venice was also one of the most important centers of music in Europe, from Gabrieli and Monteverdi in the 17th century to Vivaldi, Albinoni, and Marcello in the 18th. Venice had more than its share of great composers. Antonio Vivaldi, perhaps the most popular of all Italian composers today, was born in 1678 on the Piazza San Giovanni in Bregora here in Venice, perhaps in the house on the left, which looks nice but can't be connected to him by any documentary evidence. This is an anonymous portrait of him. Although he's wearing a wig, he had red hair, for which reason he was always called Il Prete Rosso, the Red Priest, and he was ordained in 1703. His father was a violinist in the orchestra of San Marco in Venice, and Vivaldi began his own professional career as a violinist there too. But in the year he became a priest, he also took a job as music teacher for the girls' orphanage of Santa Maria della Pieta, and he was to be connected with this organization for essentially the rest of his life. Although it's been pretty much rebuilt since his day and he wouldn't recognize the facade at all, this is what the Church of Santa Maria della Pieta looks like today, just east of the Doge's palace. The orphanage doesn't exist anymore, but in the 18th century it housed as many as 5,000 to 6,000 girls who were educated in the civilized arts, like music, which it was hoped would attract quality husbands for them. And out of this swarm, Vivaldi put together an orchestra and chorus that was known all over Europe for its ability, and for which he wrote most of his 400-plus concerti. He also wrote much other music, both secular and sacred, including some 50 operas. Since even before Vivaldi's day, Cremona, just about 100 miles from Venice, has been the most famous place in the world for the manufacture of string instruments, and the availability of some of the best such instruments ever made may well have had something to do with the success of Vivaldi's all-girl ensemble. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London owns a violin made by Andrea Amati in Cremona in about 1564, and some consider this the oldest playable violin in the world. And Cremona was, of course, also home in Vivaldi's day to the families of Giuseppe Guarneri and Antonio Stradivari, the two most famous names in the history of string instrument manufacture. In this picture you can see a pair of Stradivari owned by the New York Metropolitan Museum. Stradivarius lived to be 93 and made over 1,000 violins, violas, and cellos. Exactly what makes them so fine is still argued about. Some think the varnish is the secret, and while the original composition of that is now hard to determine even with sophisticated chemical tools, some fellow has recently acquired a patent for what is called Stradivarius-style varnish. They usually sell now for upwards of $1 million. And there are occasionally controversies over claims to authenticity, like the one which has involved the so-called Messiah violin recently. This is an interesting painting by Francesco Guardi, a younger contemporary of Canaletto, in which we see the girls of the Santa Maria della Pieta orchestra performing for some society function. And we're going to hear one of Vivaldi's most famous concerti now, the Spring Concerto from the Four Seasons. This is an especially interesting performance taken off an old Decca LP made about 1965. It features an all-Stradivarius orchestra put together by the celebrated Italian violinist Ruggero Ricci, and it's not very often that you get to hear an entire orchestra playing Stradivari. Keep in mind, however, that although you're going to hear an all-Stradivarius orchestra, you're going to hear it via an all-Sony recording system, so some of the nuances just may be lost. And while we hear the music, we'll see some more of Canaletto's views of 18th century Venice. This is Caneletto's view of Santa Maria della Salute from the Piazzetta now. I said that Canaletto isn't even mentioned in Jansen's Standard History of Art, and back in the 19th century, John Ruskin called his work miserable and heartless. Many modern connoisseurs prefer the style of Francesco Guardi, which is more impressionistic in a sense, and painterly, as they say. And this is Guardi's impression of the same subject, and perhaps it is fair to call his style more poetic and less prosaic, more spirited and less cerebral, more artsy and less craftsy, but the truth is most people I know prefer Canaletto. And just for comparison's sake, this is an actual photo of the same subject. In 1740, Vivaldi came here to Vienna to produce an opera and died before it could be finished. Of all cities in the world, this is the one which most deserves the title of musical capital. When Vivaldi arrived here, though, it had still to earn that title. Haydn was only 8 years old, and Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and Schumann, and Brahms were still, of course, in the future. In the 12th century, the Margrave St. Leopold III of Babenberg moved his headquarters from Melk to the Kahlenberg Hill north of the city, and his son Henry became the first Babenberg Duke of Austria and established himself in a fortress where the square known as Am Hof is today. The wall around the city, which used to be where the Ringstrasse is today, was begun in his son Duke Leopold the first day. You can see just a bit of the Ringstrasse at the lower left, I think. In the 13th century, Rudolf of Habsburg became Holy Roman Emperor and began building what has been known since as the Hofburg, though as it stands, little of it goes back beyond the 18th century. His son Albert was made the first Habsburg Duke of Austria when the last Babenberg died without an heir, but Vienna didn't really become the permanent primary residence of the Habsburgs until the 16th century. In about 1760, Bernardo Bellato, the nephew of Canaletto, painted this view of the city from the Belvedere Palace. We'll get a closer view of this picture in a minute, but it's easy enough to make out the Cathedral of St. Stephen there in the center, as well as the Karlskirche on the left, the Schwarzenberg Palace at left center, and the Salesian Convent at the right. Beyond the wall, which you can barely make out, is the Hofburg complex, although it looks quite different today. Both the Karlskirche and the Schwarzenberg Palace were built outside the wall, beyond the glacis, or open space in which nothing could be built, so that an attacking army would have to cross a wide free fire zone. It was actually over this glacis that the Ringstrasse was laid out in the 19th century when the wall was torn down. The word boulevard, in fact, comes from the same root as bulwark, and the boulevards of Paris, too, were laid out in a similar way, where the wall or bulwark used to be. This is a photo of something like the same view today. The cathedral is visible enough and the Salesian Convent Church at the right, but that's about all we can still see, with the palace and the Karlskirche off screen to the left. This is a closer view of Bellato's picture, with the Karlskirche again at the left, the Schwarzenberg Palace at the right. The most important Austrian architect of the day, Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, was involved with both of these buildings. The Hofburg complex is between them beyond the glacis, and the wall, which you can see more clearly now, is also there between them. The Opera House would be about in the center of this picture today. The cathedral is just partly visible at the extreme right. This is Bellato's picture of the Neue Markt, the New Market Square, with Georg Raphael Donner's famous Providence fountain decorated with the four main rivers of Austria, represented by nudes which offended Maria Theresa, so that they were ordered removed. The originals are now in the Belvedere Museum with copies here. On the right is the old Melgrube Theater, which was also the work of Fischer von Erlach. It no longer exists. On the left is the Kapuzinerkirche, where important Habsburgs were buried from the 17th to the 20th centuries. And this is the way the Neue Markt looks today. At the extreme right is the Ambassador Hotel on the side of the Melgrube Theater, and the Kapuzenkirche is on the left still there, restored since the Second World War. You can barely make out the Providence fountain in the center. People often report having seen strange things in the Habsburg crypt of the Kapuzenkirche, and I saw something strange there myself. One of the big lead coffins was standing open on sawhorses, and a fellow was removing whatever or whoever was in it with a vacuum cleaner. Sic transit gloria mundi. This is part of the Hofburg itself as it looks from the air today. Again, this is mostly 17th to 19th century. The impressive Michaelerplatz facade in the center wasn't completed until the 1890s. At the upper left is the Leopold Wing, built by Leopold I. This is where Maria Theresa lived, and the apartments here are decorated in the Rococo Austrian style of the 18th century. The section at the top is called the Amalienhof, after the wife of Joseph I, Maria Theresa's uncle. The famous winter or Spanish riding school is in the building built by Fischer von Erlach at the lower left. This is the other side of the 17th century Leopold Wing. The President of Austria lives here today. And this is the National or Hofburg Library, which was off the lower left corner in the aerial picture. It was also the work of Fischer von Erlach. As national libraries go, its collection isn't very large, 1.5 million books and manuscripts, but it has the largest collection of books printed before 1500 in the whole world, and is also, as one would expect, in possession of important autograph manuscripts by all the famous Viennese composers. And among those was, of course, Franz Joseph Haydn, of whom this is an anonymous portrait. Haydn was born in the village of Rohrau, not far from Vienna, where his father was a carpenter. Like Handel, whose father was a doctor, he's an exception to the general rule that composers have musicians for fathers. He had a relative who was a teacher and church choirmaster, however, who was impressed with his musical ability, and at just the age of 5, he was allowed to go and live with him and begin his musical career. When he was 8, his singing ability got him into the Vienna Boys Choir, from which he was discharged at 17 after his voice changed. His father refused to permit him to undergo an operation, now no longer legal, to prevent this, which was just as well. Not many castrati became Farinelli. During part of the next decade, he lived at number 11 Kohlmarkt, where the red and white banner on the left is a bit in the distance, near the Michaelerplatz facade of the Hofburg, but that wasn't there in his day. For the next 10 years or so, he led a pretty bohemian life, playing in taverns, brothels, at weddings, and so on, until he met Niccolo Porpora, who had been a competitor of Handel's in the London opera business and was also the teacher of Farinelli. And through Porpora, Haydn soon made other important contacts, including one in 1761 when he was hired by Paul Anton Esterhazy, one of the richest men in Europe, to be the assistant director of his orchestra. This is the Esterhazy Palace on the Wallnerstrasse in Vienna today. After Paul Anton's death, his son Nicholas appointed Haydn director of the orchestra, and he spent most of the rest of his life in the employment of this family, which spent its winters here and its summers on one of its many country estates. It was for the Esterhazys that he wrote most of his 104 symphonies, and some put the actual number higher, as well as much other music. In the 19th and early 20th century, Haydn's reputation fell considerably. In as late as 1967, Will Durant joked that he didn't really write 104 symphonies, rather just the same one 104 times. And Durand said that only some 8 or 10 still live, and in fact at that time some of them had not even been published. Since then, however, all 104 of his symphonies, the generally accepted 104, have been recorded by 3 different orchestras. This is Schloss Esterhazy now. Public concert performances, as we think of them today, of orchestral music, were still rare in the mid-18th century. So this was a great opportunity for Haydn, and he made the most of it. His work made the 4-movement symphony the standard, which would be followed by most important composers for over a century, and he is also often considered the essential inventor of the string quartet, the most important form of chamber music. His married life was, however, not so successful. He married a woman who had no understanding of his genius, used his manuscripts to line bread pans, and to whom he refers in letters simply as that infernal beast. As a good Catholic, divorce seems never to have occurred to him, although murder may have. He did have a 15-year affair with an Italian singer at the Esterhazy court, but she finally got tired of waiting for his wife to die and married someone else. When Frau Haydn finally did die in 1800, however, he was nearly 70 and never remarried. They had no children. This is the auditorium here now, and we're going to hear the Presto movement from one of Haydn's early symphonies, number 21. Another view of the auditorium. Just waiting for a Haydn quartet to be played here. A harpsichord that belonged to him at Eisenstadt. A peculiar instrument called a baritone, sort of like a cello with a set of what are called sympathetic strings that aren't bowed but rather vibrate when the others are bowed. Nicholas Esterhazy was a great fan of this instrument, and Haydn wrote over 200 pieces for it. This is for Tod now, across the border in what's now Hungary, and the Esterhazys also owned it. This is another view of it. And this is Schönbrunn, the summer home of the Habsburgs in the suburbs of Vienna. And we'll be back here after the break and then go on to London.